Alright, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. We are back here on Theory and Theology. Gonna jump into some Egypt theory. So, pretty much the book of Exodus has been some inspiration for what I am currently studying about. I came across these two videos that are maybe a little conflicting. Let me see. So they basically, it's Dr. Titus Kennedy talking about, the potential for proof that the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt. Also proof of the Exodus, the mass amount of Hebrews leaving from Egypt. So I'm not going to go into the exact details of all the proof just because, it's pretty involved. But for the arguments for the Exodus and slavery of the Hebrews in Egypt, Titus Kennedy is for that evidence. He uses some Egyptian ancient papyrus pieces of proof, some ancient historical pieces of proof in records of past pharaohs, some bits of proof with the dates, and then locations where the Hebrews or Israelites were found, either in the, proof of them being in Egypt, proof of them being in Canaan. I guess the main argument against, so Bart Ehrman and Paulogia did this episode about looking at this Titus Kennedy episode, where he talked about what he wrote in his book about proof for evidence of the Exodus and Hebrew slavery in Egypt. They go by each kind of point that Titus Kennedy makes, and they kind of break it down, saying that, where they find the argument to potentially be faulty. But for a lot of it, they didn't really provide evidence as far as what would be archaeological type evidence or historical evidence. They speak more to the logic and philosophical kind of soundness of the debate and the argument, like, okay, like, just saying this doesn't prove that it does or doesn't exist or whatever. So I would have liked to see more actual, like, proof of what they were saying on their end, like, what's the argument against, because those aren't arguments that I'm too familiar with. So for people saying that, the Exodus was something like the story being like propaganda, or the story being like it was false, it didn't happen, anywhere from there being some conflicting claims about were Hebrews even slaves, or did they even leave, and was it the same amount of people that was listed in the Bible? Did they actually leave? And, is there evidence for them, for this nomadic culture that was, roaming around for 40 years in the desert? Is there evidence of any archaeological evidence found? Many scholars believe that there should be some kind of pottery or like proof of their existence. And so, because of the lack of like physical archaeological proof after digs and things, they say, the other side of the argument is, that there were no slaves in Egypt. They didn't leave in a mass exodus. But then they start the story of like, how did the Israelites, or the whatever name they call them, how did the Israelites end up, where we start seeing them popping up in other historical records, where there is proof of them being there. So I'm going to talk more about what Titus Kennedy said, because he actually used like information, like kind of more details, versus looking at the soundness of the argument. So one thing that I found pretty interesting was just the way they look at the argument, how they talk about either proof for or proof against. And so for the scholars that say that there's proof against, saying that it didn't happen, because there's no evidence archaeologically, they state that that's not necessarily proof that it didn't happen. Just because there's no evidence doesn't mean it didn't happen. But what is actual other proof that it didn't happen? So a lot of times people look to the records, right? And one question that I initially had while talking to a friend was, we hear a lot about Egypt, about the pyramids. There is a theory out there that the Hebrew slaves built the pyramids. I'm sure I'm not the only one who has taught that or learned about that. I've never heard proof around it or anything. There is some proof about, brick making, building making, but they don't describe more details. So my initial question when we started talking about pyramids and things in Egypt was, okay, so with Jewish writing, there's so much writing, so much detail. Like, even if you look at the book of Exodus, or, when they're wandering in the desert, and, even the specifications of building this temple in the desert, this movable tent kind of temple, for worship and sacrifices and all these things, rituals. Basically, there's all the specifications that get listed, right, of what they're expected to do. And then we go from there, from all the specifications, and it talks about what actually happened, how it was built, what gets completed, and how to the specifications. It's like, I always wondered why they didn't just put a sentence that was like, and then they followed all of those instructions, versus repeating it, saying all the steps that they took to actually go rule by rule, right? So I was kind of thinking about that, and I was like, the Bible's pretty detailed with rules and laws and dimensions and all this kind of information about how to do what and when and why. And, if, that is part of a history of a people, that there's these documents about all these kind of details about how they're supposed to live their life, what they're supposed to do and not do. Why is it that when it comes to the pyramids, there's no information in there? And one idea that I was kind of coming up with was, well, the culture was different after slavery. And so pretty much the timeline, if I'm not mistaken, looks like 40 years before Moses was in Egypt as a baby, raised, and then came back later on. Somebody mentioned towards the end of, I think it was Bart Ehrman, he mentioned that the names Moses and Aaron, they're Egyptian names. Those aren't Hebrew names. So they're not, like in Hebrew, like Jewish people will pronounce Moses' name Moshe, not Moses. And Aaron is Aharon. It's not Aaron. Those names Moses and Aaron, and you see the name Moses come up in Egypt. He's not the only Moses that's listed. So you see that name. It's not a Hebrew name. And so it is interesting that, the two major people, the two major leaders in the Hebrew account of the Exodus, Moses and his brother Aaron, don't have Hebrew names. I believe Miriam was the sister. I'm not familiar with her meaning. But anyways, in order for Moses to be saved, he was put in that basket, right? And found by the Egyptians, one of the leaders' daughters or something along those lines. And so he was raised there, right? So very familiar with the culture. Probably would have been really familiar with the leadership. They were familiar with him. And for him in his adult years to take his own people out of Egypt, out of slavery, that's like a big thing, right? So they mention, Dr. Titus Kennedy mentions that some of the proof for is that, Egyptians didn't really have records of embarrassments or failures. And so, especially like the leadership, the rulers didn't document, like on the sides of temples and all the hieroglyphs and all those things, they wouldn't have been documenting, something like all the slaves left and were pursued by her soldiers who drowned in the ocean in pursuit, like that would be considered a loss, right? You lose your free labor. And whichever ruler was in charge at that time which is something that they are talking about too. There's a specific leader in charge. I can't remember his name, but he says it. The specific leader that was listed as being in charge, the Pharaoh at that time, was likely not going to record that that happened during his rule, and things like the plagues and that kind of thing likely wouldn't have been recorded either. And they talk a little bit more about that when they talk later on about the Ipuwer Papyrus. It's like a poem that was written by someone named Ipuwer. We'll talk more about that later once we get to that part of the notes. But they say that, there's this conversation that talks about just general stuff, what it says in the Bible, in the book of Exodus. And I would, encourage people to read this for themselves so they kind of know the story. But there are years that they're trying to figure out, like, when would this Exodus have been taking place, right? Because how is it not written in Egypt's history? And so there are different places in the Bible where it is written about, like, I can't remember the specific example they used, but they stated that, there are other passages in the Bible. I don't know if it was in the book of Judges or Kings, First or Second Kings or what, but where it says, like, during this year of this king's rule of the Israelites, an Israelite king's rule, talking about basically talking about his rule and how he sorry, I lost my train of thought. Like, during his rule, what year approximately that rule was in comparison to when the Israelites had left Egypt. So it's like this king's rule was during whatever year after the Israelites fled from Egypt. And so they use those types of things to try to figure out the dates, and they say there is some discrepancies between some of those Bible dates versus the date that historically has been kind of taught about when that actually occurred and took place. They also are a little more confused about the amount of Hebrew slaves. So the number that seems to have left Egypt in the Bible is like hundreds of thousands of people, versus they state, it's possibly more likely that it was tens of thousands of people. So there's some argument around that, about how many people and what years did this happen. That's just kind of like the general kind of information you would want to know, right? They look at slaves having Semitic names. Now, Bart Ehrman talks about Semitic names being like of Semitic culture, not necessarily pointing only to like the Hebrews. Hebrew is one Semitic language. There are multiple other Semitic languages, and so there's that. Bart Ehrman did make a comment about himself being on the board and committee of the New Revised Standard Version Bible, and the creation of that Bible version, and how he was in a room with multiple Hebrew language and Semitic language scholars, and a lot of them mention stuff along the lines of basically like the term that they use for clan when they say how many people left versus how many like clans left. He was saying like that term, most of the scholars in that room weren't confused about that term, and while Titus Kennedy was saying that it's possible that that term could have been mistranslated, Bart Ehrman said when he was on the board, nobody was raising that concern about, the translation of that term. And so there seems to be a little bit of interest in this, in certain terminology, and I don't know all the terminology that's being debated. They only mentioned that part about the terminology for the word that would have meant not the actual number, but like what that number is. Like, is it clans? Is it people? Is it families? Like, what is it? Like maybe a little weird example. Like, in our family once, we had this group of other families who were local family members, extended family, come over, and I think we overheard that there would be like 5 people, but they meant 5 families, and so it ended up being like 40 people instead of like 5 people. And so my friends came over, we were at the beach, we come home to a house full of 40 people, versus when we were telling our friends, oh, come over, we're going to have a barbecue or lunch or whatever, and my family's going to be over, and we're expecting just a few people, and we walk into a house of like 40 people. And something that was funny was, my dad, we're across the street from a store, and my dad basically went shopping, but instead of taking the car, he walked, and so he went shopping to get, the food for the barbecue, and he comes across the street, we see him, because I'm outside with my friends, and we see him coming across the street with a shopping cart full of meat and other stuff, because, he's got to cook for like 40 people. So, that was something that happened. But yeah, just an example, a little silly example of like, it does make a difference if somebody says 5 people versus 5 families. 5 families of people, versus 5 people. So it's like, that's a big difference, right? So if there's a term like that being used to account for how many slaves left Egypt, slaves or servants, I don't know which word to really use, but I'm just going to say slaves, left Egypt, basically, they're taking that term into consideration. And when it comes to Semitic names that they found on like a list of, I think it was a list of servants, they look at the names and state that these were Semitic names. They also identify that the names were names of like the female version of the names. I don't know any specifics about this list. I don't recall what it is, what the name of it is, but I'm gonna try to get that information for later and maybe dive into some of this at a later date. There is a biblical account of a time when the Hebrews were enslaved in Egypt and not being given enough straw, and the straw was used to create these bricks, And the bricks were used in turn for like making buildings and things as the slave labor. And there's this account of not having enough straw. And so they weren't given enough straw to make their bricks, therefore not meeting the quota. And because they didn't meet the quota, there's this account of them being beaten. And there's also a similar account in the Egyptian records of, and I don't know what those records are called, but there's some historical Egyptian records that do account a similar story of either, I don't know if it was one story account or like a time period. I have to look back into that. But if it was like a story or a time period when they were not given enough straw, and so they couldn't properly make enough bricks, and so they couldn't make their quota. So that story appears in not just the Bible, but in an Egyptian historical record. There's this other kind of cultural, traditional thinking about, how the Bible often says, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, or God hardened Pharaoh's heart, or whatever the wording is about the heart, which is why, the slaves weren't able to leave Egypt when Moses kept saying, the famous phrase of "let my people go," and for Pharaoh to keep on saying no, 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 and then that eventually leads to all these plagues. And even during the plagues, Pharaoh's saying no pretty much until the death of his firstborn son, and then that's when they leave. And then they get into some other information about the son that I don't really understand, but about Pharaoh's son, there's some details about that. And yeah, so the part about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, there is this cultural belief back then. I don't know if it still exists, but maybe it does. I don't know much about the culture, but in that ancient culture, there was a hardening of Pharaoh's heart. They interpreted that as, based on this idea that when a person, dies, they weigh the heart versus, I guess, like feathers or a feather or something. And that the more a person does wrong during their life, it's supposed to add weight to that heart. And so a heavier heart, maybe bigger or heavier heart, would indicate more wrongdoing. Like a person whose heart was really heavy after their death would mean that maybe they were like a bad person or something along those lines. And so they do think that, that type of concept potentially might be something relevant, just like because that phrase does keep coming up again. That idea does come up multiple times during that story in the Bible about Pharaoh's heart being hardened. And some people say it indicates maybe sin. Some people say, it indicates some kind of wrongdoing, that this Pharaoh kept doing wrong and kept doing wrong and kept doing wrong. So this Ippur papyrus, this Ippur papyrus is basically a poem that, a lot of scholars look at this poem. They look at these thematic and linguistic poem, and they compare it to Exodus events, Some people say it's not the same exact thing or the same topic, but some of the interesting facts that they point out about the Ipuwer papyrus is that some of the wording is from around the 18th dynasty time period. And so they're saying, is this similar to like the time period when, Pharaoh would have been around during that time period, making problems for the Hebrews. They look at the content of the poem. How it was constructed. They look at the different concepts that are mentioned. So they talk a lot about death, river turned to blood, that there's some other parallels that they mention, like darkness, some issues with grain, some issues with pestilence, mourning, deaths, the absence of Egyptian gods, like the absence of the presence, or feeling the presence of Egyptian gods, and gold, silver, and jewelry, being in the possession of slaves. So that is a document that historians look at, and they ask questions about, is this relevant to the Exodus or not? Because it sounds like poetry that would have been written about that time period, and with all those different types of parallels kind of lining up, and the wording being like from the 18th dynasty time period. They kind of say that potentially this poem would have been related to, I think it's an Egyptian poem, would have been related to the historical events during that time. They mention there's a mention of nomads of Yahweh. That's mentioned at another time period in the Bible. Sorry, no, not in the Bible, but in history, in Egyptian history, they talk about nomads of Yahweh. So saying that, there is something written in Egyptian records mentioning a nomadic group, and the god that they followed, which was Yahweh. And I don't know what that text was called, but these are all very fascinating and interesting topics to really look at.